The morning started like any other day on New Haven Colony. Taemin Park sat in his small communication booth drinking his third cup of coffee and listening to the usual chatter from space traffic reports from cargo ships, updates from the mining stations, news broadcasts from Earth that were already 3 weeks old. Nothing interesting ever happened in this quiet corner of the galaxy. New Haven was a peaceful farming colony built by humans who wanted to escape the chaos of Earth. They grew. Crops sold them to passing traders, and lived simple, quiet lives. The 300 colonists had left behind the wars and violence of their home planet. They thought they were done with fighting forever. Taemin was about to take another sip of his coffee when his communication equipment started making strange noises. The signal was weak and full of static, but something about it made him put down his cup and lean forward. He adjusted the receivers, trying to clear up the transmission. What he heard next changed everything. The voice was soft and musical, like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. It spoke in broken human language with words that seemed to carry deep sadness. "We are the Altari," it said. "Our world burns. Our children cry in darkness. We have no weapons, no armies. We only know how to heal, not to hurt. Please someone help us before we are all gone." Taemin felt his blood turn cold. He had heard about the Altari before. They were one of the most peaceful species in the galaxy, known throughout space for their healing abilities and kind nature. They never fought wars, never conquered other worlds. They spent their time creating beautiful crystal cities and helping sick travelers who came to their planet. The transmission repeated, the same desperate message over and over again. Each time Taemin heard it, his heart sank deeper. He could hear children crying in the background. Explosions echoed through the static. Someone was attacking these innocent people, and they had no way. To defend themselves, Taemin ran from his communication booth toward the center of the colony. His boots pounded against the dirt paths between the crop fields. Workers looked up from their farming as he passed by. They could tell from his face that something terrible had happened. The community center was a simple building made from local wood where the colonists gathered for meetings and celebrations. Taemin burst through the doors and shouted for everyone to come quickly. People dropped what they were doing and rushed inside. Farmers still covered in soil, mechanics with grease on their hands, teachers with children following behind them. Jin Woo, Lee, the elected leader of New Haven, stood up from his chair. He was a calm man who had worked as an engineer on Earth before coming to this quiet world. "What is wrong?" "Taemin," he asked. Seeing the panic in the young man's eyes, Taemin connected his portable communication device to the center's speaker system. The desperate message from the Altari filled the room. The musical voice pleaded for help while explosions and crying children could be heard in the background. The 300 colonists listened in shocked silence. When the message ended, nobody spoke for a long moment. The only sound was the gentle hum of the air recycling system. Finally, an old farmer named Dong-ho Kim cleared his throat. "Those poor people," he said quietly. "They are being slaughtered, and they cannot fight back." A middle-aged woman named Sun-mi Choi, who ran the colony's small school, stood up with tears in her eyes. "Those children," she whispered, "I can hear the fear in their voices. How can anyone hurt beings who only want to heal others?" More colonists began to speak up, sharing their horror at what they had heard. The Altari were famous across the galaxy for helping others. Their crystal cities welcomed sick travelers from every species. Their healers worked for free, asking nothing in return except the chance to ease suffering. Jin Woo raised his hand for silence. He looked around the room at the faces of his people. These were good humans who had left Earth to build something better, but they were farmers and teachers and mechanics, not soldiers. What could they possibly do against? "Whoever was attacking the Altari, we should contact the Earth Defense Force," said Min-ho Park, a former mechanic. Maybe they can send help. Tamin shook his head sadly. I already tried, he said. The defense force is 3 months away at best. By then, it will be too late for the Altari young Heejin. Kim stood up from the back of the room. She was only 18 years old and worked as a pilot flying cargo ships between New Haven and the nearby trading posts. Her eyes burned with determination as she looked around at the adults. We may not be soldiers, she said in a strong, clear voice, but we are human. That has to count for something. An uncomfortable silence filled the room. Everyone knew what she meant. Humans had a reputation across the galaxy. They were known as a violent species that had spent centuries fighting wars and perfecting the art of destruction. Other species called them monsters because of their history of conflict, but sitting in that simple community center surrounded by crops and peaceful homes, the colonists had almost forgotten their species' violent past. They had come to New Haven to escape that legacy, to prove that humans could be farmers and teachers instead of warriors. The girl is right, said old Dong-Ho Kim. We cannot just listen to those children crying and do nothing. Earth made us into what we are. Maybe it's time to remember why other species fear us. Jin Woo felt the weight of leadership heavy on his shoulders. He looked at the faces around him. These people had followed him to this quiet world, believing they could leave violence behind. Now they were asking him to lead them back into the darkness they had tried to escape. What do you want me to do? He asked the room. We have no warships, no weapons, except hunting rifles and farming tools. We are 300 people against whatever military force is destroying the Altari. How can we possibly make a difference? Taemin stepped forward with fire in his eyes. We send a message, he said. Not to the Defense Force, not to the government. We send it to everyone else. All the ships and stations and colonies across human space. We tell them what is happening to the Altari. What kind of message? Sunmi asked. Taemin looked around the room at his friends and neighbors. The innocent are dying, he said slowly. Earth's children are being asked to help. Who will answer? The room erupted in discussion. Some people thought it was impossible, others worried about getting involved in galactic politics. But underneath, all the arguments was a growing anger. These peaceful colonists were remembering what it felt like to be human. Jin Woo called for a vote. Those in favor of sending out a call for help raised their hands. The result was unanimous. Every single person in the room voted to answer the Altari cry for help, even though they had no idea how they could possibly make a difference. Taemin hurried back to his communication booth and began sending messages across human space. He broadcast the Altari distress, signaled to every ship station and colony he could reach. Along with it, he sent their simple message: the innocent are dying. Earth's children are being asked to help. Who will answer? For hours, nothing happened. Taemin sat at his equipment waiting for some kind of response. The colonists went back to their daily work, but everyone kept glancing toward the communications center, hoping for good news. Then, just as the sun was setting over New Haven, the first response came in. It was not from the Earth Defense Force. It was not from any official government agency. The voice that crackled through the speakers was rough and dangerous. This is Captain Bo-Ra Choi of the cargo hauler Iron Wolf, the voice said. We got your message. We are coming. Tell them the monsters are on their way. More messages began flooding in from across human space. Smugglers and pirates, black market traders and mercenaries, convicted criminals and exiled soldiers, all of them responding to the call for help. All of them coming to answer the Altari cry for help. Sitting in his communication booth, Taemin realized what they had done. They had not called for heroes or saints. They had called for the monsters that polite society tried to forget. And those monsters were coming. Word spread through the darker corners of human space like fire racing through dry grass. In the asteroid mining stations, where desperate men worked dangerous jobs for barely enough credits to survive, the story of the crying Altari children reached. ears that had heard too much suffering already. Dong-Soo Han was covered in rock dust and sweat when he heard the message in the miners' common room. He was a big man with scarred hands from years of working the asteroid drills. Around him sat dozens of other miners, men and women who had left Earth because they had nowhere else to go. They were the forgotten ones. The people polite society did not want to remember. The recording of the Altari distress call played over the station's communication system. The musical voice, pleading for help. The sound of children crying, the explosions in the background. Every miner in that room had heard violence before, but this was different. This was innocent people being slaughtered. "We got to do something," said a woman named Youngja Seo. She was small but tough as steel cables. Her face was marked with old scars from mining accidents, but her eyes burned with anger. "Nobody hurts kids like that. Nobody." Dong-Soo stood up slowly. His massive frame cast a shadow across the room. These miners were not rich people. They worked 16-hour shifts in dangerous conditions just to afford food and air. But when he started passing around his hat, asking for credits to buy weapons and fuel, every single person in that room gave what they could. 3 systems away on the prison transport ship, redemption-convicted murderer Kyung-ho Yoon sat in his cell, listening to the guard talk about the Altari message. Yoon had been a soldier once, a good one until the war on Kepler 7 broke something inside him. He had killed civilians during a raid, and Earth Justice had sent him to spend the rest of his life on a prison colony. But hearing those alien children cry in the recording brought back memories he had tried to forget. He remembered why he had become a soldier in the first place. It was not for glory or money. It was to protect people who could not protect themselves. He had failed that mission once, and innocent people died. Now he had a chance to make it right. "Listen up," he called to the other prisoners in the transport. Most of them were killers like him. Men and women who had done terrible things and been cast out by society. But they were still human, and that meant something when children were crying for help. The plan Yoon came up with was simple and insane. They would take over the prison transport, not to escape, but to join the rescue mission. The guards would never agree to it, so they would have to be forced. The prisoners knew this was likely a suicide mission, but none of them cared. They had already thrown their lives away. This gave them a chance to throw them away for something good. When the prisoners made their move, the guards were ready for a fight. What they were not ready for was what happened next. The first guard they captured was a young man named Ki-tae Lim. He had heard the Altari message too, and when the prisoners explained what they wanted to do, he made a choice that surprised everyone. "You are right," he said quietly. "Those children need help. If you are going to fight for them, then I am going with you." One by one, the other guards joined them. The prison transport Redemption became the first official ship to volunteer for the rescue mission. Its cargo hold full of killers and criminals who had found something worth dying for. Across the galaxy, the same scene played out again and again. In the smuggler havens where black market traders sold illegal goods to anyone with enough credits, the story of the Altari reached people who made their living breaking laws. But even criminals had lines they would not cross, and hurting innocent children was one of them. On the space station, Haven's End, which existed in the gray area between legal and illegal trade. Captain Sora Beck ran the largest arms-dealing operation in 3 sectors. She sold weapons to anyone who could pay no questions asked. But when she heard the Altari message, something changed in her heart. Instead of selling weapons, she started giving them away. For free, she opened her warehouses to anyone who would promise to use the guns and explosives to help the dying aliens. Her crew thought she had lost her mind, but they followed her anyway. These were people who understood loyalty, even if they did not always understand right and wrong. The loan sharks who charged impossible interest rates became financiers for the rescue mission. The brothel owners who sold pleasure to lonely spacers started collecting money for fuel. and supplies. Even the drug dealers who poisoned minds with illegal chemicals found themselves moved by the sound of alien children crying for help. Each group that decided to help made their way toward New Haven, carrying whatever they could scrape. Together, battered cargo ships loaded with weapons, modified pleasure craft carrying volunteers who had never fired a gun in their lives, prison transports full of convicted killers who wanted one chance to be heroes instead of villains. The sight that greeted the peaceful colonists was both terrifying and beautiful. Former pirates with missing eyes and metal limbs unloaded military-grade weapons from ships that barely held together ex-soldiers, with haunted expressions worked alongside. Reformed criminals to modify civilian vessels into makeshift warships. Everyone shared one thing: they were tired of running from who they used to be. Dr. Meek-young Seo, who served as New Haven's doctor and the closest thing they had to a spiritual leader, walked among these dangerous volunteers. Every day she treated their wounds, both physical and mental. She saw the scars that covered their bodies, the haunted look in their eyes that spoke of terrible things they had done or witnessed, but she also saw something else. These people that polite society had thrown away had found their purpose again. They were not fighting for money or glory or revenge. They were fighting because someone had asked for help, and they remembered what it meant to be human deep down, where it counted. A former pirate captain named Jae Sung-oh showed her the modifications he was making to his ship. He was installing ramming spikes on the front, turning his vessel into a weapon designed for suicide attacks. When she asked him why he was doing this, he looked at her with eyes that had seen too much death. "Doc," he said in a voice rough from years of shouting orders during space battles, "I spent 20 years taking things from people. Now I got a chance to give something back, even if it kills me." The fleet that assembled above New Haven grew larger every day. 200 ships, then 300, then more. Ships kept arriving from every corner of human space, each one carrying volunteers who had heard the call and decided to answer it. They were smugglers and thieves, murderers and outcasts, but they were also human beings who could not stand to listen to children cry for help. Captain Bora Choi of the Iron Wolf became the unofficial leader of this strange fleet. Her ship was a modified cargo hauler that she had turned into a home for herself and her small crew. She had spent 15 years running illegal goods through Empire space, dodging patrol ships, and living one step ahead of the law. But when she heard the Altari message, something inside her broke open. She remembered being a child herself, scared and alone when her parents died in a mining accident. She remembered how it felt to cry for help and have nobody answer. She would not let that happen to the Altari children. The planning sessions for the rescue mission took place in New Haven's community center. The same room where peaceful farmers had voted to send out the call for help now hosted meetings between some of the most dangerous criminals in human space. Maps of the Altari system covered the walls. Weapon inventories were discussed over coffee and homemade bread. Young Hye-jin Kim, the 18-year-old pilot who had spoken up at the first meeting, found herself becoming something of a symbol for the assembled fleet. She was young and innocent, everything these hardened criminals had lost or thrown away. But when she spoke about saving the Altari children, every scarred veteran and reformed killer in the room listened. "We may be the monsters that Earth created," she told them during one planning session, her young voice carrying across the crowded room. "But today we are going to show the galaxy what monsters can do when they fight for something good." The volunteers cheered at her words. These people who had been called monsters their whole lives finally had a chance to be the kind of monsters that protected the innocent instead of hurting them. They knew this was probably a suicide mission. The Altari message had mentioned a powerful enemy with advanced weapons. Most of them would probably die in the battle to come, but none of them cared anymore. They had spent years running from their past, hiding from what they had done or what had been done to them. Now they had found something worth dying for, a chance to save children, they had never met, a chance to prove that being called a monster was not always a bad thing. As the fleet prepared to leave New Haven for the dangerous journey to Altari space, each ship broadcast the same message on all frequencies. "This is the human rescue fleet. We are coming to help. Hold on just a little longer. The monsters are on their way." The human fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of Altari territory to find a scene that would haunt their dreams forever. The once beautiful crystal cities that had welcomed travelers from across the galaxy now lay in ruins. Their rainbow-colored surfaces that used to catch starlight and turn it into music were cracked and blackened. Smoke rose from the wreckage like tears falling upward into space. Captain Bo-Ra Choi stood on the bridge of her ship Iron Wolf, staring at the tactical display. With growing horror, Corvan warships patrolled the system like hungry sharks. Their dark hulls were covered in weapon ports and armor plating designed to strike fear into anyone who saw them. These were not ships built for exploration or trade. They were instruments of war and conquest. The Corvan Empire had been expanding across this part of the galaxy for over 200 years. They conquered peaceful worlds, turned the population into slaves, and stripped the planets of anything. Valuable Admiral Sung Ho Kang commanded the occupation force from his flagship, the Subjugator. He had destroyed 17 civilizations for the Empire, and the Altari were supposed to be just another easy target. What Admiral Kong had not expected was for anyone to come to help the Altari. The Crystal people were so peaceful they did not even have a word for war in their language. Most species in the galaxy simply stayed away from Corvan expansion areas. Nobody wanted to fight an empire that had conquered hundreds of worlds. The human fleet's arrival changed everything. Captain Choi opened communication channels to every Corvan ship in the system. Her voice was calm and deadly as she delivered her message. "This is the human fleet, you have 5 minutes to withdraw from this system before we introduce you to some very old Earth customs." Admiral Kang could barely believe what his sensors were showing him. The approaching fleet looked like a collection of scrap metal held together by desperation and spite. Modified cargo haulers bristled with weapons that had been welded onto their hulls. Prison transports carried boarding parties of convicted killers who had volunteered for this mission. Even pleasure yachts that used to carry rich tourists now sported missile launchers where hot tubs used to be. The Corvan commander laughed when he first saw the human fleet. His intelligence officers assured him that these ships were no threat. They were civilian vessels with improvised weapons crewed by criminals and outcasts. How could they possibly stand against the might of the Corvan Empire? But then his intelligence officer provided a detailed analysis of human military history, and Admiral Kang's laughter died in his throat. These monsters came from a species that had spent thousands of years perfecting the art of war. Earth's history was written in blood and fire, with innovations in violence that made even the Corvan Empire seem civilized by comparison. Humans had invented chemical weapons that melted the flesh from bones, nuclear bombs that could destroy entire cities, biological weapons that turned the victim's own body against them. They had fought wars that lasted decades and killed millions of their own people just to prove a point. They were a species that treated violence as an art form. When the 5-minute deadline expired, hell came to visit the Altari system. The humans did not fight like any civilized species Admiral Kang had ever encountered. They used tactics that would be considered war crimes if there was anyone left alive to file the charges. Ex-pirate Jae Sung Oh was the first to show the Corvan forces what human warfare really looked like. He pointed his modified destroyer directly at a Corvan heavy cruiser and pushed his engines to maximum power. His ship was already damaged from the jump into the system, but he did not care about survival anymore. He cared about making the enemy pay. The collision between the two ships created a fireball that could be seen from the surface of Altari Prime. The Corvan cruiser broke apart like a toy hit by a hammer, while O's destroyer vanished completely. Both crews died instantly, but the explosion took out 2 other Corvan ships that were too close to the blast. This was not how civilized species fought wars. In normal space, combat ships kept their distance and exchanged fire until one side's shields failed or their engines were damaged. Then there would be surrender negotiations and prisoner exchanges. But humans did not fight normal space. Combat. Former criminal Unji Nam led a boarding party onto a Corvan battleship using nothing but an old cargo shuttle and determination. The shuttle was shot full of holes during the approach, but somehow made it to the enemy ship's docking bay. Nam and her team of reformed criminals fought their way through the corridors using combat knives and improvised explosives. The Corvan crew could not understand what they were facing. These humans seemed to ignore wounds that should have killed them. They kept fighting even when they were bleeding and broken. They treated death as just another weapon in their arsenal, something to be used against the enemy instead of feared NAMs. Boarding party reached the battleship's engine room and planted charges that turned the massive warship into a drifting wreck. But the cost was terrible. Only 3 of the 20 humans who boarded the ship made it back alive. The rest died fighting. In the dark corridors, far from home, all across the Altari system, the same scene played out again and again. Human ships that should have been destroyed kept fighting long past the point where any sane crew would have surrendered damaged vessels. With hull breaches and failing life support systems continued to attack Corvan ships until their reactors finally exploded. The Corvan forces had expected an easy victory against what their scans showed as a ragtag collection of civilian vessels. Instead, they found themselves facing an enemy that fought with the fury of demons and the determination of angels. Human ships rammed Corvan vessels even when it meant certain death for the human crew's captain. Choi coordinated the chaotic battle from her command center on the Iron Wolf. Her ship had been hit multiple times and was losing atmosphere, but she refused to retreat. Around her, the most unlikely fleet in galactic history fought with tactics that no military academy had ever taught: reformed. Prisoners worked alongside ex-pirates to coordinate suicide runs. Smugglers who had spent years avoiding fights now flew directly into enemy fire to protect ships carrying medical supplies. Former drug dealers turned their knowledge of chemistry into improvised weapons that ate through Corvan armor plating. Down on the surface of Altari Prime, the crystal people hiding in underground shelters could see the battle raging in space above their world. Explosions lit up the night sky like deadly fireworks. Each flash represented ships dying and crews being vaporized, but for the first time in weeks, the Altari began to hope. These strange, violent creatures from Earth were not fighting for conquest or glory or profit. They were fighting because someone had asked for help, and they remembered what it meant to answer that call. The Altari could not understand this kind of warfare, where beings would die for strangers they had never met, but they understood the result. The Corvan occupation. Fleet that had seemed invincible was being torn apart by an enemy that refused to follow the rules of civilized combat. Human ships that should have been destroyed hours ago continued to fight on sheer determination and fury as the third day of battle began. Admiral Kang found himself facing a tactical situation he had never encountered in his long military career. His superior firepower and advanced technology meant nothing against an enemy that treated every engagement as a chance to die for something meaningful. The humans were losing ships at a terrible rate, but they never stopped fighting. They coordinated attacks with split-second timing, using nothing but short-range communications and an understanding of each other that seemed almost supernatural. Reformed criminals anticipated the moves of ex-military officers they had never met before. This was what made humans monsters in the eyes of the galaxy, not their technology or their numbers, but their absolute refusal to accept defeat when they believed they were fighting for something right. They would rather die as heroes than live as cowards, and that made them the most dangerous enemy the Corvan Empire had ever faced. The battle for the Altari system was far from over, But already the outcome was becoming clear. The monsters of Earth had come to answer a cry for help, and they would not stop fighting until every last Altari child was safe or every last human was dead. The battle for the Altari system raged for 3 days straight, turning the space around the crystal world into a graveyard where ships from both fleets drifted like broken toys. The human forces fought with a desperation that surprised even themselves, using tactics that walked the line between brilliant strategy and complete madness. Captain Bo-Ra Choi watched from her damaged bridge as another human ship rammed itself into a Corvan destroyer. The explosion lit up her view screen like a dying star. Both vessels vanished in a ball of fire and superheated metal, taking their crews with them into the darkness of space. On the surface of Altari Prime, the true horror of the Corvan occupation became clear to the human landing parties. The peaceful Crystal cities had been turned into processing centers where Altari civilians were sorted like livestock. The strong were loaded onto transport ships bound for labor camps on distant worlds. The weak were simply eliminated with mechanical efficiency when the first human soldiers reached the surface, led by the reformed prisoners from the transport ship Redemption. They found scenes that would break the minds of weaker beings. Former murderer Kyung-ho Yoon had thought he understood cruelty from his time as a soldier and his years in prison. But when he saw Altari children locked in cages designed for animals, he fell to his knees and wept. The Altari were a species that communicated partly through color changes in their crystal skin. When they were happy, they glowed with warm golden light. When they were sad, they turned deep blue like ocean water. But the Altari in the Corvan camps had turned completely gray, the color of fear and despair, the color of hope. Dying Yoon stood up slowly, wiping the tears from his scarred face. Around him, the other reformed prisoners were seeing the same thing. Beings who had spent their lives healing others, locked up like animals waiting to be shipped to slave camps or execution centers. It was wrong in a way that went beyond law or morality. It was an offense against the basic idea of life itself. The Corvan ground forces learned quickly why Earth's children were called monsters throughout the galaxy. When Sergeant In-ho Park saw an Altari mother trying to protect her injured child from Corvan soldiers, something ancient and primal awakened inside him. These were not trained fighters. These were prison guards used to dealing with helpless captives. Park had been a killer before his capture and imprisonment. But he had never killed for the right reasons until now. The Corvan soldiers did not just die. They were torn apart by hands that remembered what it meant to protect innocent life. The other human prisoners fought beside him with the fury of beings who had found something worth dying for. Dr. Mi-kyung-seo worked around the clock in a makeshift field hospital, trying to save both human and Altari casualties. She had followed the fleet from New Haven because she knew there would be wounded people who needed help. What she had not expected was to watch her people transform before her eyes. These criminals and pirates and outcasts cradled dying Altari children in their scarred arms, whispering soft words in languages the aliens could not understand, but somehow felt in their hearts. Former drug dealer Hyo-jin Lee, who had spent years poisoning people with illegal chemicals, now spent his time mixing medicines to ease Altari suffering. The crystal children seemed to sense something in their human rescuers that even the humans themselves did not fully understand. When young Min Seo, the daughter of New Haven's teacher, was brought to the field hospital with terrible injuries, an Altari child no bigger than a human toddler crawled over to comfort her. The little alien could not speak human language, but it placed its tiny crystal hand on Min Seo's forehead and began to glow with gentle blue light. The human girl's pain eased, and her wounds began to heal faster. The Altari child had used its natural healing abilities to help the daughter of the beings who were dying to save its people. Dr. Seo watched this scene with tears streaming down her face. These monsters from Earth had traveled across the galaxy to fight for strangers they had never met. And now those strangers were using their precious healing gifts to save human lives in return. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever witnessed. The turning point in the ground battle came when the human forces managed to capture one of the main processing centers the Corvan guards had expected to face trained soldiers with proper equipment. Instead, they found themselves fighting reformed criminals who used improvised weapons and tactics. No military manual had ever described former pirate captain Jae-Sung-Oh had survived the destruction of his ship and made it to the surface with a handful of his crew. They found a Corvan facility where hundreds of Altari were waiting to be loaded onto slave ships. The guards were torturing some of the crystal people, trying to make them demonstrate their healing abilities. Oh and his pirates attacked the facility with nothing but salvaged weapons and burning rage. They did not try to take prisoners or follow the rules of civilized warfare. They simply eliminated every Corvan in the building and freed the terrified Altari inside. When Admiral Sung-Ho Kang received reports from the surface about human fighting tactics, he could barely believe what his officers were telling him. These were not soldiers fighting for their government or their species. These were criminals and outcasts fighting for an ideal that transcended their own survival. The Corvan Empire ruled through fear and overwhelming force. Their enemies usually surrendered when they realized they could not win. But these humans from Earth seemed to fight harder when the odds were against them. They treated impossible situations as personal challenges to overcome. Admiral Kang found himself captured when human boarding parties took control of his flagship, the Subjugator. He expected to be executed immediately following standard military protocol. Instead, he was brought before Captain Choi in what used to be his own command center. She did not kill him. Instead, she forced him to watch as human volunteers risked their lives to evacuate Altari civilians from the burning cities below. Former criminals formed human chains to carry injured crystal people to safety. Ex-pirates used their ships to transport refugees away from combat zones. "You want to know what makes us monsters?" Admiral Choi asked as they watched the rescue operations on the main view screen. "It is not that we are good at killing, though we are very good at that. It is that we cannot stand to watch innocent people suffer. That is what makes us dangerous to empires like yours." The Corvan commander watched in growing amazement as beings who should have been his enemies worked together to save lives. Former soldiers who had committed war crimes now carried Altari children to medical stations. Drug dealers who had destroyed lives with poison now donated their own blood to help injured aliens. "We fight for conquest," Admiral Kang said, slowly trying to understand what he was seeing. "We take what we want and eliminate resistance. You fight for nothing. You gain nothing from this captain." Choi smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "We fight for the idea that children should not have to cry for help in the darkness," she said. "We gain the knowledge that when someone asks for help, Earth's children will answer." Admiral Kang realized he was looking at something his military training had never prepared him to face: an enemy that fought, not for land or resources or political power, but for abstract concepts like justice and protecting the innocent. The Corvan Empire had weapons that could destroy planets, but they had no defense against beings who would rather die as heroes than live as cowards. As the battle continued to rage above and below the surface of Altari Prime, the human forces began to understand the true cost of their decision to help. These monsters of Earth were paying a terrible price for their compassion, but not one of them regretted answering the call for help. More human ships continued to arrive at Altari Prime as word spread through Earth space about the desperate battle. The story of criminals and outcasts fighting to save innocent aliens had reached even the respectable parts of human society. Medical ships appeared carrying supplies and doctors. Earth Defense Force vessels finally showed up with professional soldiers and proper military equipment. But it was the monsters who had arrived first that made the real difference: the pirates' criminals. and outcasts who had answered the original call had already done something impossible. They had broken the Corvan war machine through pure determination and fighting tactics that violated every rule of civilized warfare. Young Hye-jin Kim, the teenage pilot from New Haven, had become a legend among both the human forces and the grateful Altari. Flying her modified civilian transport through combat zones that should have killed her, she had managed to evacuate over 3,000 Crystal people from the most dangerous areas. The Altari children called her the Flying Angel, though she kept insisting she was just a farm girl who had learned to fly cargo ships. Her small transport had been hit by enemy fire dozens of times, but somehow she kept flying rescue missions into areas where larger military ships could not go. The Crystal people themselves were amazed by their rescuers. These humans fought with a savagery that should have terrified any peaceful being, yet they showed infinite gentleness when dealing with the wounded and helpless. It was like watching demons turn into angels depending on who needed their help. Altari healer. Crystalline Song of Mourning worked alongside Dr. Mi-kyung Seo in the field hospitals trying to understand these contradictory beings, the same human hands that could tear apart Corvan soldiers with bare strength, would carefully feed injured Altari children who were too weak to eat by themselves. How can one species contain such violence and such compassion? The Altari healer asked Dr. Seo as they worked together to save the life of a human soldier who had taken shrapnel while protecting Altari civilians, because we choose which one to be, Dr. Seo replied, bandaging a wound that should have been fatal. We can be monsters when monsters are needed, and angels when angels are needed. That is what makes us human. The Corvan Empire's response to their defeat at Altari Prime was swift and terrible. Admiral Kang's superior fleet commander Vashtor arrived. With a massive armada containing over 500 warships, these were not occupation forces designed to police conquered worlds. These were pure war machines built for one purpose: destroying enemies of the Empire. The message Fleet Commander Vashtor broadcast to the human fleet was simple and direct. Surrender now or watch as we turn this entire system into radioactive dust. You have fought bravely for these crystal creatures, but you are vastly outnumbered. Your noble gesture ends here. The human response surprised even the Altari. Instead of retreating in the face of overwhelming odds, more ships kept arriving from across human space. Every settlement within jump range sent whatever they could spare. Merchant captains volunteered their cargo. Haulers for suicide missions, criminal syndicates that usually preyed on honest spacers, showed up with heavily armed vessels and grim determination. Captain Bo-ra Choi coordinated the defense from the bridge of her battered ship, now held together, mostly by hull patches and the will of her crew. Around her, the greatest collection of human misfits in galactic history prepared for what everyone knew would be their final battle. They were outnumbered 5-1 by an enemy with superior technology and training. The reformed prisoners who had started this whole desperate mission gathered in the cargo bay of the transport ship Redemption for what might be their last meal together. Former murderer Kyung-ho Yoon looked around at his fellow criminals and outcasts, men and women whose society had thrown away, and felt something he had not experienced in years: pride. These were people who had done terrible things and been cast out by civilized society, but they had found something worth dying for in the cries of alien children. They may be monsters, but today they were monsters fighting for something that mattered more than their own lives. As the Corvan Armada approached the human fleet, spread out in a defensive formation that would make professional military officers weep with despair. It violated every rule of space. Combat relied on impossible coordination between independent commanders and depended entirely on each ship's crew being willing to die for strangers they had never met. In other words, it was the most human thing imaginable. Former pirate Jae-sung Oh had managed to salvage another ship from the wreckage of the earlier battles. This one was an old Corvan transport he had captured and modified with human weapons. He looked at his mixed crew of pirates, criminals, and Altari refugees who had insisted on staying to help fight. "You know we are probably all going to die," he told them, as the enemy fleet grew larger on their view screen, an Altari child who had lost its parents. In the occupation camps looked up at him with eyes that glowed like starlight. "We know," she said in her musical voice, "but you came when we called for help. Now we stay with you." Similar scenes played out across the human fleet. Altari civilians who should have been evacuated to safety refused to leave the ships that had saved them. They wanted to stand with their rescuers, even if it meant dying together. Former criminals found themselves fighting alongside the very people they had been trying. To save the Corvan Armada was organized in perfect military formation. Each ship knew its role in the battle plan. The attack would be coordinated and efficient, designed to minimize Corvan losses while maximizing damage to the enemy. It was everything a proper military operation should be. The human fleet looked like organized chaos, ships of different sizes and capabilities scattered across space with no apparent battle plan. Each captain seemed to be making up their own tactics as they went along. There was no central command structure, no standardized equipment, no unified strategy. But there was something else. Something the Corvan Empire had never encountered in 200 years of conquest. There was a shared understanding among the human crews that transcended military discipline or tactical doctrine. They all knew why they were fighting and what they were willing to sacrifice. Young Hyejin Kim sat in the pilot seat of her battered transport ship looking at the approaching Corvan Armada. Through her headset, she could hear the voices of hundreds of human ship captains all talking at once. Planning, coordinating, sharing information in a chaotic network that somehow made perfect sense. She thought about the Altari children. She had rescued the fear in their crystal eyes when she found them. The hope that returned when they realized someone had come to help. They had called out into the darkness asking for help, and the monsters of Earth had answered. Now those monsters were about to face their greatest test. The largest fleet in Corvan history was coming to destroy them, and everyone they were trying to protect. The odds were impossible. The enemy was too strong. The human ships were too few and too damaged to have any real chance of victory. But as Hyejin listened to the voices of pirates and criminals and outcasts all preparing to die for alien children they had never met, she realized something important. It did not matter if they won or lost. What mattered was that they had answered the call for help. What mattered was that when innocent beings cried out in the darkness, the monsters of Earth had come running. The final battle for Altari Prime was about to begin, and the monsters were ready. The final battle for Altari Prime became the stuff of legends across the galaxy. The massive Corvan Armada arrived expecting to crush the human fleet through overwhelming force. But they encountered something no military strategist could have predicted. An enemy that fought with the fury of the damned and the righteousness of angels combined fleet. Commander Vash Tor watched from his flagship as his perfectly organized battle lines advanced toward the scattered human ships. His tactical computers showed an easy victory. The enemy was outnumbered, outgunned, and using civilian vessels against proper military warships. This should be over in minutes. But then the humans began to fight, and everything Vash Tor thought he knew about warfare fell apart. The human fleet did not try to match the Empire's discipline or superior firepower. Instead, they fought like the monsters they had always been called, ex-pirate captains. Coordinated suicide runs with split-second timing, reformed criminals, piloted boarding shuttles directly into the heart of enemy capital ships, carrying nothing but improvised explosives and determination. Captain Bo-Ra Choi of the Iron Wolf led the attack with her battered cargo hauler. Her ship was barely held together after days of combat, but she drove it straight into the center of the Corvan formation. Her voice echoed across all human communication channels as she gave the order that started the impossible. All ships attack. Everything you have. Give them hell, and show them what monsters can do. What followed was 3 hours of the most chaotic, brutal space combat in galactic history. The humans used tactics that seemed to violate basic physics, ramming damaged ships into healthy ones using civilian transports, as improvised missiles somehow coordinating complex maneuvers through nothing but shared desperation and mutual understanding. Former criminal Yunjinam led a boarding party onto a Corvan super dreadnought using a cargo shuttle that had been shot, full of holes. Her team of reformed killers fought through the enemy ship's corridors with weapons salvaged from the battlefield. They captured the ship's bridge and turned its massive guns against the rest of the Corvan fleet. The Corvan forces could not adapt to this style of fighting. Their training emphasized discipline formation, flying, and proper military procedure. But the humans ignored all military protocols. They fought like individual predators who somehow managed to work together. As a perfect pack young Hyojin Kim, the teenage pilot who had become known as the Flying Angel, volunteered for the most dangerous mission of all. The Corvan flagship's shields were too strong for conventional weapons, but someone needed to get close. Enough to plant charges on the shield generators. Her modified transport was fast enough to make the run, but everyone knew it was a one-way trip. As she began her final approach toward the enemy flagship, something remarkable happened. Every human, ship in the fleet, pirates, criminals, reformed prisoners, and even the newly arrived Earth Defense Force vessels turned their weapons on the Corvan command ship simultaneously. The combined firepower created a corridor of destruction that allowed the young pilot to reach her target. Dr. Mi-kyung-seo watched from the field hospital as the enemy flagship began to break apart its shields, failing under the coordinated assault. Around her, wounded humans and Altari alike cheered as they saw Hyejin's small transport racing away from the massive explosion. The girl who insisted she was just a farm pilot had somehow survived the impossible mission. The destruction of the Corvan flagship broke the enemy fleet's coordination. Admiral Sung,